welcome to season 2, episode 3 of Chasing the Vision in partnership with Viola Management Associates and Exit Strategies. I'm your host, Michelle Blevins. I'm with CNR Magazine, and as always, I'm joined by our amazing experts, JT Cry from Exit Strategies and Tim Hull from Violand. This episode to me is a big one and an important one. It's one that I think owners and leaders often dread. It's the whole financial management component, but it's also cash flow. Cash flow is a huge deal in the restoration industry. I think that it's a problem that's actually kind of grown in recent years. I know in State of the Industry, that's the number one thing that's keeping contractors up at night. And then we're also seeing year over year claim volume is down at the beginning of the year, and it's taking a minute for everybody to kind of get going. So to be able to manage your cash flow is such a critical component of being a restoration company that's going to be around for a long time versus having to dissolve quickly because you don't have any cash. So that's kind of what we're here to talk about today is the element of financial management, the keys to cash flow, how that ties into your value as a company, all of those good things. So, all right, I'm going to stop talking now. So, Tim, I'm going to toss it over to you to kind of give us a high level overview of why financial management is so important, so key for a restoration business.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming back. Episode 3 already. That's hard to believe. 2025 is going fast. And you're right, Michelle. When we think about where we're at today in the industry, cash flow, especially collections, is a hot topic right now.
Yeah.
I know our clients and a lot of people that we talk to, I'm sure JT, you can attest to that. The AR turns are probably larger today than we've seen in most recent years.
Yep.
And it's because people are holding on to the money. And really, that's the name of the game. I've always said for a long time that at least when dealing with carriers, you have to understand that you're dealing with banks. And essentially, that's what they are. They're investment institutions, institutions. And the longer they hold on to a dollar, the more money they make with it. And I think restorers can take a good lesson out of that, kind of that learning page there, and understand that the same holds true for you and your business. The idea is to move the money from receivables to your own bank account as quickly as you can to fund the growth. And there's two real big components to me in this discussion here, Michelle. The first one is that people like to talk about what their business is worth in terms of value, and JT will talk a little bit about that, I'm sure, here and how that relates to financial management. And we all talk in terms of multiples, right? I talked to so and so, and they sold their business for 7 times, 8 times, 9 times, whatever X you want to put on top of it. And the next question is, well, 7 or 8 times what? Um, and then people like to brag about how big their top line sales are, but they rarely talk about what their bottom line returns are. So when we talk financial management, there's a lot of things to consider there. I'll leave the valuation discussion of how that has an impact on that to JT. But as an operator and being more concerned with how people run their businesses, proper financial management really it checks 2 boxes for me. The first is funding growth. And we see that evidenced in companies as you watch them move through their life cycle, especially over, maybe a decade or more, where they go through that period of growth where they've got deep bottom line margins, cash is prevalent, and some do a good job of funding a war chest that they can use for future growth and reinvestment in the company. Others go out and buy boats and houses and, do those other things. And we're not here to criticize, but when we talk about long-term sustained growth of a company, it's important to realize that the impact of that operating capital that you're going to need to reinvest in the business, because at the end of the day, profit is a choice. You can choose to distribute it to your employees through the methods of raises. You can choose to put it on your own pocket, or you can choose to allocate some of those funds towards capital reinvestment to help you grow into the next stage of your growth as an organization. So funding growth is the big thing. The other thing is mitigating risk. And I learned this lesson really early on. Kind of grew up in the trades, and in the summers, my father was always like, look, I've worked with my back my whole life. You're going to learn the appreciation of what it means to work with your hands, and move that headache from, that ache from your back to your head. And I paid attention, and I worked for a small custom home builder, relatively small, but we built big houses. But his end game wasn't building houses. His end game was real estate investment. So a lot of the money that he had used or made over the years, he reinvested back in the business in the terms of land acquisition that were eventually used to turn into future developments. And of course, over the course of the years, you pay attention and you see the economic roller coaster that goes on. Sometimes real estate's up, sometimes it's down. At the end of the day, one of the most profound things he ever said to me was, "You need to have enough money in the bank to ride out the valleys."
Hmm.
And unless you're disciplined enough to do that, you open yourself up to a whole host of risks that exist if you're not paying attention. So when you're riding the top of the wave, make sure that you're allocating funds towards capital reinvestment in the business, or even just a rainy day fund, because those rainy days are going to happen. So you can mitigate that risk that a lot of folks are feeling right now when cash is tight, simply by having an operating fund that you can draw from.
I have a quick follow-up to that before we kick it to JT. As you're talking about kind of having this emergency fund or rainy day fund, capital investments, all of that, in personal finance, they say you should have a 3 to 6 month emergency fund and you should have you should save 10 to 15% a year, blah, 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 blah. Is there anything like that, metrics like that you recommend in the restoration space, or does it really truly depend on goals, what the future looks like, aspirations, those kind of things?
Right. Again, 30 to 60 days of what is the big question there. And I understand the philosophy, and depending on who you talk to, whether it's you're a Ramsey fan or you're
Yeah.
a whoever fan for financial management, the bottom line is you should have something.
Yeah.
Okay. When you look at having a reserve fund, I like to have 30 to 45 days worth of operating capital, fixed expenses in the bank that you can rely on. That gets you started. Again, gets you started.
Started.
Right. As you continue to make deeper profits every year, you continue to grow the business, still keep that money liquid, but then start moving some investments into some maybe more long-term secure stuff that may not be accessible. A lot of clients will move into CDs at that point. And then after that, it's buying, a piece of investment property or doing whatever. And look, I'm not a financial advisor, so I can't
Yeah.
really speak to a blanket thing that works for everybody. But back to the personal finance thing, you have to understand that they say, God, I got 6 months worth of income. Really? Do I need that? Because that's a lot of money. You have to have 6 months worth of your expenses, but take all your fun stuff and your gravy out of that. You
Yeah.
know, what do you really need
Bare
to
bones surviving. Yes.
Yes, to survive. Survive and maintain a lifestyle are two different things.
Yeah.
So
100%.
hopefully that answered your question,
It
Michelle.
did. It did. Okay, JT. So I'm going to kick it over to you to kind of give your high level overview of why financial management is so key for restoration companies.
Well, I appreciate that. And I appreciate your thorough intro. That was a whole TED talk there, Michelle. So nice work. And one quick comment on your point, Tim, about these funds to hang on to before I get to a high level. From my seat, it also depends on what sandbox you're playing in. If your daily bread and butter is mitigation and you're turning these 8 to 10, $12,000 jobs every 45 days, let's say, that's different than these $200,000, $300,000 fire jobs where they're going to get challenged. There might be appraisers, there might be public adjusters, and you might be out 180 days or more for those funds. So to me, it also depends on the sandbox that you're choosing to play in. Really not my lane when it comes to discussing accounts receivable and what needs to be there, but I've got companies that are all over the board, of course. So from a high level, we're talking about money, and money is, you know, it's like Advil, right? If two is good, four is better. If $1,000 is good, $5,000 is better. We all want more of it in business. None of us are doing this for our health. And we don't have to idolize it, but we do have to respect what it does for our businesses. We all need it to survive. It's like oxygen that way. And what's interesting is when COVID happened, and we were all in the industry for COVID, between the supply chain interruptions and the escalating cost of goods, the labor shortages, the extended AR, there's all sorts of things that happened. I think it took average operators and made them a little bit better. We all had to sharpen our pencils and learn how we were going to survive. And then it seems like the advent of software the last 5 to 10 years has gotten really good. There's some great softwares out there now that help with real-time decision making and job costing. And job costing wasn't much of a thing 10 years ago. It was hard to do. And now with all the handhelds out in the field and all these techs out there and buying receipts at Lowe's and Home Depot, it's so instantaneous now, which I think is really great. And so I think the advancements in the industry have come a really, really long way. And if we can get owners, even with small companies, to be on board with that, the accurate real time data helps in so many different ways, not only with leadership and management, but the key metrics and the incentive programs and everything you need to, all the decisions that need to be made to maintain efficiency. So I think it's come a long way from a high level.
JT, can I kind of add on to that too? Because I think
Oh, absolutely.
we started off this conversation kind of like fast and furious and hot and heavy on cash, and I went right in that direction. But your point is well taken, and I think our audience should really understand that the financial management ultimately leads to reporting.
Yep.
And the importance of that reporting is that because we're in business, the financial reports that we see really serve as the scorecard for everything else that goes in the business. We've always said for years that numbers follow, and they follow decisions and action and thought and all that other good stuff. And ultimately, the end of the day, it produces a number. And just because it's got a dollar sign in front of it doesn't mean it's any more or less important than a piece of data. And we live in a data-driven society.
Yeah.
And I know, just speaking as a consultant, we always tell our clients, the better information you give us, the better data you give us, the better advice you're going to get and the better decisions you're going to make. So it's critically important to manage your financial information and your financial data in your business so that you can make good decisions. I mean, really, at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah. And that's a perfect segue actually to kind of my next question here of Tim, talk a little bit about, I want to start on what restorers are doing right instead of starting on the topic of where could restorers improve and do better. So let's start with like the good stuff, right? So what are some things that you're seeing companies do well when it comes to this financial management, maybe cash flow aspect?
Right. So that's the thing I love about the restoration industry is that for the most part, we're not dealing with stock prices. We're not dealing with, a lot of financial elements that come into play with larger corporately held, entities. And managers have the ability to make decisions at a more of a grassroots level. And from a small business perspective, I always have a good appreciation for the owner that kind of subscribes to that homemaker's theory of economics, and basically kind of goes like, if I don't have it, then I'm not going to spend it. So leveraging yourself against future needs of the business is not really a common thing or as big of a deal as it is in larger business. Yeah, we have things like operating lines of credit, and we have other things that we can use to help grow our businesses. But at the end of the day, it's not to the degree. So we're dealing pretty much with cash in, cash out, and as long as those two things balance or are balanced in the right equation, where there's more coming in than there is going out, then it's a lot easier to manage. So I think that's the first thing that they do is they don't get caught up in the big corporate finance world. They look at it from a simplistic standpoint, and that's what I would advise any small business owner to do. The other thing that I think we do really well in this industry specifically is we have a tendency to reinvest. And I don't think we can lose sight of that. And one of the trends that I'm seeing that I'm not liking, and JT, maybe you see this too, with all the sales to private equity right now, there's more emphasis on the EBITDA.
Yeah.
And rightfully so. They paid a premium for that location, and now as a part of a roll-up or even part of a growth strategy, they want to return to the bottom line. But I don't think we should ignore the intentional reinvestment, whether it's physical reinvestment of the cash back in the business, investment in technology, investment in human capital, all those things that were necessary to grow the business that restorers really do pretty well, need to continue, at least at some degree. And of course, the last one that everybody, I think that as a small business owner in this world is they do a good job of taking advantage of the pre-tax benefits of being a business owner. So looking at that and understanding that is part of maybe your income as a business owner, It's not just the salary that you draw out of the business every year, but it's the other benefits that come along with that. So I would probably highlight all those areas and recommend the contractor continue to move forward with those philosophies.
Perfect. All right, JT, what's your take on what most owners do right from your side of the aisle, kind of the transaction value and company valuation, planning, all of that?
Well, I'm going to start right where Tim left off. The business owners, perks, personal expenses, whatever we want to call them. I'll say it was rampant, 8, 10, 15 years ago. I've seen a lot run through businesses, private educations, multiple vehicles for family members. Years ago at a show, I had a gentleman walk up and he leaned over and he said, "How do you handle building a house through your business?" And I said, "You mean like you built a deck or re-roofed a rental, something like that?" He goes, "No, I created a job file and I built a house." I said, "Wow, it's interesting for sure." So nothing surprises me anymore when it comes to perks. But I think with the emphasis the last several years on value and M&A activity and all the growth that's happened, there's this focus on value. And Tim is right. It's done good things for the industry, and sometimes it isn't so good. But I think in general, owners are running their businesses a little bit cleaner. And I have sort of beat the drum for years on, if you're going to take a perk, and we all do it on some level, it's business owners have that right. And a lot of times they're spot on and accurate. It just has to have a paper trail, right? We've got to be able to defend that perk when we're talking to a potential buyer. And sometimes even with a lender for a line of credit or whatnot. So I think more and more now owners are not using their businesses like a formal piggy bank, which has been a real blessing. The activity the last 3 to 5 years has driven this focus, which I think is great. Financial cleanliness, I mentioned that earlier with the software. That's brought it front and center. And I think there's even, seems like every couple of months, there's a new software out there that's helping with financial cleanliness. But I think, and Tim mentioned it earlier, top line versus bottom line sales. And I even hesitate to say bottom line. Most people think that's a net. And when it comes to value, when it comes to valuation of a business, I'm not as concerned about a net profit as I am an adjusted EBITDA figure. It's much more comprehensive. It includes a lot more than net profit does. But what I think it's done in a good way is it's brought everybody's focus to what is the real value? How am I expensing things? What does 2 or 3 percentage points mean for my business? And what might it mean 3 or 5 years from now? So I think it's just brought into focus some real critical factors for owners.
Yeah.
JT, just out of curiosity, so talking about the personal benefits, the add backs that we talk about when you value a business,
Mm-hmm.
and then obviously coming at it from a transactional standpoint, you mentioned you have to substantiate that.
Mm-hmm.
Is there ever any discussion, at least maybe even from the buyer side, where they look at that as an opportunity then to maybe improve the bottom lines by eliminating some of that?
Always. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. We as owners, you can add back certain things. Things like the personal RV that is the mobile office. It's our cat office, right? And it gets used once a year for a cat event and 5 times a year to go fishing.
Mhm.
There's things like that are on the books, and I say that with a smile on my face. So yes, some of those truly personal expenses, those are represented in an adjusted EBITDA, and a buyer will not have that expense moving forward. So it absolutely does help, which is why we adjust them. Now, there are certain gray areas, and this could be a whole episode, Tim. You probably know that. There's gray areas with family compensation, with perks and distributions, and things that are not necessarily business related and may be considered moving forward. And so much of it depends on how the seller today wants to play moving forward, if they're going to continue working for the buyer, which is a very common scenario when you're a larger company and you've rolled some equity and you've got let's say an earnout or a holdback you've got to provide some targets for, and a whole other discussion. But the short answer is yes, we can account for them.
Very good.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so JT, let's stick on this lane though that you were starting to go down here. We've talked about the good stuff. So now where are some areas that restorers could work on improving when it comes to their financial management? Where do they tend to struggle when it comes to maybe getting to a good valuation, improving the valuation, whether or not they're going to sell?
Oh, appreciate you letting me be the bad guy first, Michelle. I want to kick that to Tim right away. From my seat, WIP is an issue, right? It comes back to job costing, and I've already mentioned it a couple times. When it comes to WIP, one of the things that always jumps out, and there many smaller companies don't even track WIP. They know it's there, but it's 10,000, 50,000, 75,000, and it's always there. But in a transaction, all of a sudden it needs to be accounted for. As a seller and an owner of the business, you can't incur 10, 15, 30, 70% of those costs, sell the business, and then the seller gets a check for it, when the receivables come in. So a lot of the WIP is reimbursed. Well, if you're not tracking it, how do you get reimbursed for that? And what kind of metrics? It creates almost as much discussion as net working capital, which really should be its own episode. That'll be somewhere between fascinating and nightmarish. But the WIP is a great place to start. Is just job costing and all jobs in process. What are you actually spending? Another, and I think I touched on it earlier, is just paying attention to the details. For so many years, there was enough money to be made in this industry that if the bank account was above this line, we must be doing good. And there was some truth to that. And businesses just aren't. They're not run like that anymore. They just can't be. You're not going to make it. And I think from my seat would be due diligence. It used to be that buyer and a seller would shake hands and you do a deal with a 2-page contract and you're off to the races. You've just sold your business. Well, due diligence now is a very, very invasive process. If somebody's writing a check for 10 million, 20 million, $50 million, they're going to prove that the business is what we said it is. Mm-hmm. And that's not done by trusting the owner. It's not done by trusting their controller. They already trust them, but with a check that size, they're going to verify. And so they do get CPA backup copies. They get to ask hundreds and hundreds of questions. And if there's misalignment somehow, or if an advisor or a seller has stretched the truth somehow, they're going to find it. And so in a lot of this financial documentation, sellers are always taken aback by just how many questions are asked. And there are hundreds. And part of the reason for that is that NA, not applicable, is a legally binding answer. And it's never the question that gets asked that gets a, well, it's the question that doesn't get asked. So there are, typical restoration company, they act like the buyer's buying General Electric or Verizon. It feels like that because there's so many questions, but they just have to understand some of that financial cleanliness and what it means for due diligence. So with those 3 points, if you kind of wrap your head around those 3, you're going to be much better off moving forward.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. So Tim, from your point of view, what do you see owners struggling with when they are trying to get maybe their finances organized in the business, trying to clean up their financials, those kind of things?
Yeah, obviously, I'm going to come at it from more an operations standpoint.
Yep.
JT, I think, did a nice job of painting the picture for what it looks like when you eventually get to the point where somebody wants to buy your business. But before you can get there, we have to be focused, in my opinion, and we have to be focused at least on what is the impact of the information have on my ability to make decisions in my business every day, right? And one of the first things we do when we first start working with clients will be clean up their books, because we have to be looking at the numbers in the right buckets. We've got to be looking at the right ratios that have the right denominators and numerators and all that stuff before it can make any sense to us. So really, I think if I had to give somebody a piece of advice, if you're interested in really cleaning your books up, quote unquote, it would be understand which buckets those numbers should go in. And approach it with a degree of discipline where you're putting it in the same buckets every single period. Because if you've got, let's say wages for your project managers up in COGS, and then 3 months from now you decide, well, I watched this guy speak on a webinar and he said it should be down below. Well, I'm going to put it down below now. And then at the end of the year, you try to compare apples to apples. And then next year you decide to reverse it again. And that's just one example of one expense. the more times you do that, the less validity or real value that those numbers have, if anything. So I would say, get the right numbers in the right buckets, talk to a professional about what a chart of accounts for a restoration company of your
Mhm.
size should look like, organize it as such, put together a cost approval process, and make sure that each month or each period those numbers get put in the right buckets at the right times. That is the first step, and I think solving what you brought up was a really good point, JT, in the WIP side of things.
Mhm.
Understanding that you have to be looking at revenue and cost in the same period of time,
Mhm.
whether that's a month, a quarter, whatever, a year even. I was actually, I got a financial statement up right now on my screen that has got a surplus profit in 24 and a deficit at the bottom line in the first quarter of 25.
Mhm.
Well, the difference between those two, the client's sitting there going, well, I look great in 24 and I suck in 25. Well, the real answer is you didn't look so hot in either one of those periods. The numbers were just in the wrong buckets. In 24, you had
Mhm.
all the revenue associated with that job, and then you didn't book it until 25.
Mhm.
Let's spread
Mhm.
that out and let's see where it really falls. So, um,
Yeah, and Tim, I just want to interject one quick thought here. You're hitting all the way around it. I just want to throw in the word interpretation.
yeah,
We both work with clients who understand a half a dozen key numbers on a P&L or an income statement, but they don't understand the rest of it. And
Mm.
being able to interpret those and then how to apply that to their business is key. And that's missing for a lot of owners.
right.
Mhm.
That's a great point, JT. We always say like a financial checkup should be similar to like a health checkup. If you went out, if you took your blood pressure right now and it was, way higher than it should have been, well, what happened in the last 5 minutes? And is it the same blood pressure that it is consistently every day? Every number is relative to something. So, um, stresses the importance of putting it in. I know we're belaboring that point, Michelle, but I can't stress
Right.
it enough. It's you got to be looking at the same information. But the other big thing that I think restorers sometimes have a struggle with is understanding that bottom line profits and cash flow can be two different things. Not that they always are, but they can be two different things. And when clients really restorers first start their business, a lot of times they're keeping the books on a cash basis, which they should
Mhm.
be. But eventually you need to get to the point where it's more beneficial to look at it on an accrual reporting system.
Mhm.
That way you've got the cost and the revenue in the same period of time. But it does open up the question, all right, well, I made all this money on an accrual basis. Where's all the cash? And
Mhm.
that's where you have to go to the balance sheet and look and see what that working capital ratio looks like. More than not, it's probably sitting in receivables. Or, maybe you took deposits on the job, you spent it, and then you use that money, those profits to then fund the next stage of growth. So it's a constant state of motion, but understanding that you can be profitable at the bottom line and still cash poor. It is
Yes.
possible.
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay, so I'm going to reverse our questions a little bit because I also want to talk about, you've talked about AR a few times. So I think let's dive in a little bit to the role that accounts receivables plays in cash flow. And also Tim and JT both offer some advice for restoration contractors that might be struggling in this area. I do think sometimes people don't realize that in accounting world, people specialize in different things, and your person who's doing your books might not be great at doing collections or receivables or whatever. And you might need a little extra leverage in those areas to help collections flow or whatever that may be. So, Tim, I'll toss this to you first. Like, what role does AR play? And what advice do you give contractors who might be struggling in that area?
Yeah, it plays a critical role, obviously, because as JT alluded to before, I think you said, cash is like the air that you breathe. We always say it's the blood that runs through the veins of the business.
Mhm.
You can be profitable, but if you run out of blood, you're dead. Cash is, you told me I can't say where cash is king because
You can. I don't know if it's trademarked or not, but we can
we're
say
going to
it.
say it. It's cliche to say, but
It is.
it's
It's great.
critical. It's
It
it's
is.
critical to survival. And again, back to my earlier comment about it being a game, moving money from one bank to another is nothing more than a game. So the delay tactics that you hear everybody talk about from insurance carriers are valid. And and it really comes back to the fundamentals of accounting. You don't pay somebody's bill unless it's due, and you collect the money as soon, as fast as you possibly can. So you're trying to balance that in and out. It's kind of like, your heart pumping the blood through your body. If it's taking it in faster than it's pumping it out, then you're in good shape. But if it's vice versa, we got a problem.
Mhm.
Back to what you can do to really assist in the AR side of things, put together a process and stick to it. I can't enforce that enough. A lot of times we just, we finish jobs, we send the bill off, and we expect that people are just gonna, write the check, whether it's a carrier or it's a customer. But you have to do the follow-up. Send them a bill, call and make sure they receive the bill. And then ask them, when will the check be issued? Where is it going to be sent? Whose names are going to be on it? And how much is it for? Those are my big questions. It's called a payment commitment. If you can't get the payment commitment, you've got a problem with that job. Fix the problem, then you can move on to the receivables. But good companies that have good, healthy cash flow, they're very diligent about the follow-up and the communication with the responsible parties that they're paying.
Yep.
There aren't too many people out there they go into these projects intending to screw somebody. I don't believe that's the intention most of the time. And a lot of times when the money's held up, it's because of miscommunication problems.
You have to be consistent with it. Absolutely. Okay, JT, what's your perspective on this kind of AR conversation?
Well, I just want to add one comment to Tim's. I just want to add that these positions that companies have so many times, these AR positions, they're not, uh, well thanked positions. We'll say these are kind of thankless jobs, right? And they're brutal positions to follow this system. The best companies have dialed in programs and definite system that they go through. I've seen color coded, I've seen numbered, I've seen very well structured, all the way to no structure. And those who have a structured AR collection system do much better. And part of the challenge is you've got somebody at 17, 18, $20 an hour sitting there. And historically, these are not long-term positions. And so there can be some turnover, which doesn't help. And oftentimes they're not well trained. And so getting somebody with a skill set in there who can push this AR along, I think is vital. And that's just a thought I wanted to tack on. And we've commented on it. Just to jump to point number two, we've commented on this squeeze and this game of insurance companies hanging on to their money a little bit more. I believe it, and it just lends itself more and more to the systems. And I think again, the industry has come a long ways the last 10 years, and we've got a ways to go. Based on, I mentioned it earlier, based on the sandbox that you're playing in, you've got to be well funded to play in these larger sandboxes, and it gets very uncomfortable. I mean, I've worked with clients that have been down in Florida and the Gulf, and you're waiting 18, 20, 24 months for FEMA approvals. And yes, you're going to make a lot of money, but you've spent $1 million waiting for a $2 million check, and not many companies can do that. So it becomes a very high stakes, high risk game, and you've got to figure out where your limits are if that's the sandbox you want to play in. So the processes and procedures, I just think, have to be dialed in much better than they are historically, and get some really well trained people in there. And there's probably great training programs out there for that. Tim, you probably even have some, but I think that'll go a long way towards some of the heartburn that's being created right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, just can I add on to that too? And again, not
Absolutely.
to belabor the point. Ultimately, we need to boil this down to what's going on today in the world around us, and what restorers need to know now on how they can manage their cash flow a little bit better. Remember, cash flow is a two-way street. It's about moving the money faster coming in, but it's also about managing the money going out.
Mhm.
So you also have to be disciplined on the payable side. And if you're the type of person that wants to, pay the phone bill as soon as it comes in when it's not due for another 3 weeks, you might want to take a look at some of that stuff. But we like to make excuses, I think, as business owners in this world where, oh, well, that's the way the carriers are operating this day, or that's just, it's the economy. Everybody's uncertain about the economy. Uh, Look, don't be afraid to kind of break the trend, or move in your own direction with that. you can't sit here and say that if I don't send a bill to a customer for a deposit for a job before they receive the insurance funds, that they won't pay it. Try it. If that's the way you want to go, try it. You know, if you're having problems because your invoices are held up in approvals for work that has already been completed because the carrier doesn't agree with the scope or the way you wrote your Xactimate estimate, send the bill to the customer.
Mhm.
Try those things. I mean, honestly, the dentist does it.
Mhm.
If you go to a dentist and you get a statement from them, you're going to see everything that the carrier approved. And then
Mhm.
maybe if your dentist is a decent human being, they might offer you a discount, but then you're going to get a bill
Yep.
that says you owe this at the bottom.
Mhm.
And I think we've accepted as restores for way too long that we don't want to send a bill to a customer. We're just willing to take whatever the carrier has agreed to afford to their insured through the contract of the policy. That's between the homeowner and the insurance company. There's good insurance companies and there's not so good insurance companies. And the homeowners are the ones that get to make that choice, not us as restores. But
Mhm.
they have a choice on who they want to use as a service provider. So if you feel that your services are more valuable than what the carrier is willing to reimburse them for, then go ahead and invoice for it.
Yeah.
But get serious about collecting it too.
Okay, so I want to ask you guys for takeaways in a minute, as far as takeaways of what owners and controllers maybe specifically should be doing. But I think there's one more component that we need to talk about before we get to kind of final takeaways, because we've talked a lot about cash flow and cash flow management, AR, all of those things. We haven't talked about debt, and that is a huge component of running business. I think Tim, you've touched on it maybe a few times, but we haven't talked about it. I think we should talk about it some more. So, where is debt a good thing in restoration businesses? How is that managed? How can it? This is a big, we could do a whole podcast, I think, on debt alone and leveraging yourself. But, Tim, I'll toss it to you first. I don't even know where to start on the debt question because it's a big one. But
Well, maybe it can be a teaser into a future.
yeah.
I always start off this conversation by kind of looking at the Shark Tank philosophy. You know, you look at all these good companies and they go into Shark Tank and they're asking for money
Mhm.
and they're willing to give up significant portions of their company to get it.
Yep.
A lot of times it's not because they're cash poor. And it's certainly not because they have bad companies or bad product ideas. It's because they don't have the operating capital to fund what's necessary to grow the business.
Yep.
So at the end of the day, we're all kind of fighting that same battle. And I hope that everybody that's listening, your business will get to that point at some time where the money that you have to dump back into it to get you to that next stage of growth is going to be greater than what you have.
Yep.
So going out and borrowing it, I'll make it real simple for you right now, Michelle. But there's two things I look at. One is an operating line of credit. Okay, so and I'm not talking about credit cards. A lot of people will confuse
Mhm.
that. So I'll just put it on a credit card. I'm talking about an open operating line that you will have with your bank. Usually, you also have a deposit account with them. That way, you can switch the money back and forth. But really, the operating capital line is meant to finance short-term deficits in the operating capital needs for ongoing projects. In other words,
Mhm.
you've got to lay the cost out and pay for the labor, the materials, maybe some of the work to be done to the subcontractors that are going to work on that until you get enough funds coming in to cover that. And when you talk about having 20, 30, 100 jobs going on all at the same time, that surplus and deficit continues to get, bigger and bigger. So, we recommend that the clients have somewhere around a 10% of their top line annual revenue available in borrowing ability from an operating line. That money is meant to be used frequently in and out of the line. So I might pull
Mhm.
10,000 off of it today, and then at the end of the week, I might put 15,000 back or 25,000 next week. Like that's what banks like to see because you're using it appropriately. What it's not meant to do is go out and buy capital equipment. So if you're using it to buy air movers, vehicles, an RV for for the catastrophe mobile response unit, that's not what your line is for. That's where you go to the term loan side. So now we're looking at capital loans that can be collateralized by that asset that you're purchasing. Again, because you've got the physical asset, it's not a bad debt. It's not bad debt to have because you've got a physical asset. So, but you get to the end of the year and everybody says, well, should I pay cash? Should I finance it? Should I pay the cash? Like that's a conversation with your CPA.
Mhm.
Um, but understand that if you pull the money out of your bank to pay cash for it, that is cash you don't have then to operate with.
JT, what kind of impact can debt have on a business when it comes to kind of valuation and what a company's worth?
Well, I won't add a whole lot to what Tim said, just a couple of points. The operating line of credit is a wonderful thing. Most of my clients have them, they use them, they access them once or twice a year when they get a little extended, and they're paid off in 60 or 90 or 120 days. So it's perfect. They're using just how they should. When it comes to long-term debt, and this is back to the balance sheet, long-term debt is always paid off at the closing table. It's when you sell a company, it's called free and clear of all liens and encumbrances, or what we'll say a cash-free, debt-free basis. And so long-term debt is paid off by the seller at closing. If you've got $300,000 on a line of credit that's not paid off at the closing table, it is at that point, because you can't have that lien against the business from the buyer's perspective. So that leads to questions, owning versus leasing vehicles, and should it be a capital improvement, or should we Section 179 this right away and deduct it from our books? Those are CPA related questions. So Tim was spot on with that. What I like to do is field questions. Once I go through a valuation analysis, owners will call me for 2, 3, 4 years in advance as they're prepping and saying, should I be leasing these vehicles? Should I be buying them? If I'm going to sell a year from now, I really need a new box truck, or I need a new carpet truck, whatever it might be. So I can get a brand new one, for $100,000, or can I get a good used one for 60? Well, you're going to pay that off at the closing table. So there's a lot of discussions in there about what it means to maximize your return once you sell the business based on decisions you're making now. And you may have heard this quote, but the future cost of current decisions is big. And most owners will look back and say, oh, I really should have called you 2 or 3 years ago when I was thinking about this, because some of the decisions are so easy to make now, but unless you ask the question, it's just not even on your radar 2 or 3 years down the road.
JT, that is a great point. And I think one of the reasons why people should start thinking about planning prior to kind of getting on that exit, I'm going to steal your terminology, exit ramp that you talk about. That is definitely part of the planning process. And a lease is usually a multi-year commitment, at least. Cash is immediate today. But if you're planning on selling your business in a few years, I would highly recommend having that conversation with somebody like yourself, JT. I'm sure you're welcome to field those phone calls, right?
Well, and I'll say yes, but it's actually real. I can save somebody $50,000 with a phone. That's seemingly a really simple question from their end, and they have no idea how it's going to impact the sale and closing. So if Tim, you can handle some of those as well. They cross your desk regularly. If we can do that for the listening audience, that's what we do. It's part of the service that we offer, and we love doing it.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So takeaway time. If you two had 2 or 3 takeaways that you would give the owners, controllers, accountants, leaders, whoever it may be that's listening to this episode, that are thinking, okay, we talked about a lot. So let's have 2 or 3 takeaways of things to work on, focus on as a starting point. Tim, I'll toss that to you first.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to the buckets. Michelle, make sure the numbers are in the right buckets, and make sure that your reporting is done on a regular basis so that you can use that information to make effective, good decisions in your business every day. Once you start doing that, you'll gain an appreciation and a hunger for that data and for that information, and it only gets better from there. So start off the right way, get things cleaned up, put them in the right places, and man, it gets better from there.
All right. JT, what about you? A few takeaways?
Yeah, I'm gonna echo that, because what happens is not only does operator during your runway yet as an owner, when it comes to a sale, what happens is when buyers start asking questions and you don't have clean financials, what happens is that buyer hears, I don't know, we don't track that. Oh, we've never thought of recording that, or oh, sorry, we can't split that out. When they hear that enough, confidence starts to drop. And if they hear it one too many times, there just isn't confidence there to move forward. We've represented something and now we can't prove it. Or that buyer's trying to figure out, does it fit their model? is it something we can get our arms around? And so the clean financials, not only is it key for today and key decisions, but down the road, it definitely supports and boosts value. Without it, it can actually cost you a deal.
No doubt.
Yeah. Okay. All right, gentlemen. Well, thank you. This was a big conversation, and I know we have more topics to talk about in the future. So for anybody who's looking for more episodes, you can find them on the CNR website, on YouTube, on all of your favorite podcast platforms. If you search Restoration Today, there is bonus episodes under there, so you can listen to them there. I know you can also find them on Exit Strategies 360, violan.com. They're everywhere. So, all right. Thank you so much, gentlemen. I look forward to the next episode, and I hope you have an awesome rest of your day.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks so much.